Thank you so much, and thank you all for inviting me to speak today and to join this respected panel. I'm going to try and provide some of the background today for this issue, which is really getting a lot of attention, and people are starting to wonder what is this 111D really about. Just to give you a quick background of the organization, the Bipartisan Policy Center, where I'm a senior advisor. This is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that was formed by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Senators Baker, Daschle, Dole, and Mitchell, who wanted to find principled solutions. So it's based on rigorous analysis, negotiation, and trying to have respectful dialogue across the full spectrum. And so I think this is actually a very key issue for this, because it really does touch every part of the country, and it's really an important issue for people in terms of the implications and the potential impacts. So with that, let's see if I can advance the slides. So just to start, I wanted to point out, for those of you that aren't as familiar with the power sector, there's really quite a bit of transition going on right now in our electricity sector, and there's a lot of different factors that are influencing that. And we're really seeing a lot of changes we've already seen in the past few years and expecting in the next decade, and further additional transition. One of the key factors is certainly environmental regulations like Section 111D that we'll be focused on today. But we're also dealing with an aging fleet of generators, which at some point these units will need to retire. So many of our fleet is past the 30, 40-year mark, and we're sort of looking, and depending on the area of the country, you have more and more sort of need to think about a transition. What's the next step? The shale gas boom has really dramatically influenced the power sector, with the lower cost of natural gas making coal plants have a harder time sort of competing economically. The economics had always been that coal was the cheapest unit to run, and natural gas was there as a peaking unit to fill power. And that has, depending on the month, changed. It kind of flipped for the first time in, I don't know, maybe forever, where a few years back we actually had natural gas as the lowest cost units to run, and some of those units were running more in a baseload capacity. So it's kind of flipped back a bit more, and now we've got natural gas prices expected to stay relatively low and stable for many decades, and that has really influenced the economics of what you build when you build a new plant, and what you do to invest in an existing plant, and what kind of the future is. Renewable power is also a strong force. A lot of states have renewable portfolio standards, which have brought a lot of renewables into the market. That has to be balanced with the other units, and it also is an important force in the power sector. Electric demand, which in various points in history, we always expect electric demand is always going to go up, so you're always building more electricity capacity, more generators to meet that future demand. Things have changed quite dramatically from that perspective as well. The recession is a big part of that in terms of a short-term influence, but in terms of longer term, most projections show very little electricity demand into the future, maybe a 1% growth, which is quite dramatically lower than past projections. And a big part of that is also just energy efficiency throughout the economy is having an influence. And we are seeing, even though we're using more devices, that we're actually using less electricity to do so. And then, of course, the regulations, not just for 111, which focus on CO2 or greenhouse gases from the power sector, but there's other EPA regulations that are having an influence. So today we'll focus more on 111D. I talked a little bit, this is a very busy chart, and don't feel like you have to grasp everything that's on there, but the point I was trying to make here is that really, in terms of the electricity mix, it varies quite a bit around the country, and you have the areas of the country, these little pie charts, where you see a lot of red in the pie chart, so in like the upper Midwest, that's where it's more dominated by coal-fired generators. Where you see a lot of blue, that's the dark blue is natural gas, the light blue is nuclear, and renewables shows up as like a light purple and a pink. So you can kind of see, just as you look, across the country, there is quite a variation. There are some areas of the country that are still quite dominated by coal-fired power, others that have quite a bit more natural gas and renewables, and that influences, how these different areas of the country are going to be impacted by this regulation 111D. Just in terms of background, the power sector is responsible for 32% of the greenhouse gases total greenhouse gases in the U.S., so the number one contributor in that sector. So 111D, so there's a couple factors that kind of led to where we are today, where we have an EPA proposal that came out in June proposing standards for power plants, or proposing more of a process, guidelines to get to standards for power plants. One important milestone was last summer, President Obama released a National Climate Action Plan, which had a full suite of issues, wasn't just for power plants, but the power plant rules under 111D, as well as, I'll get to the new standards as well, but we're a very strong feature of that. And the President directed the EPA to work with states and companies and other stakeholders and get this process started under the authority of the existing Clean Air Act. So this is under existing law, and get these power plant regulations in place, and he set a timetable for that. So in terms of the timetable, there are a couple different levels, and what you care about is the bottom in purple, which is 111D. But just to give you a brief sense of what other power sector rules are happening for new power plants, this is if you want to build a new power plant of any kind. There's a rulemaking that is right now in proposal stage. It came out, was released in September, but it was put out sort of officially in starting the clock in January. And that requires new plants. If you are a coal-fired plant, it requires an emission rate, which essentially means that plant's going to have carbon capture and storage technology in place. For a gas unit, there's also a standard, but that's not as binding. Modified and reconstructed plants, you don't hear much about this because it's not that binding of a requirement, but there is a rulemaking process for that as well. And then for existing plants, what we saw in June of this year when EPA put out the proposal, again, just a proposal for 111D, they called it the Clean Power Plan. So 111D and Clean Power Plan are kind of synonymous. That June proposal is now in a public comment period through October 16th. People can submit comments. The states are very much encouraged to submit comments on that rule. Throughout the rule, I've heard different estimates of 200 or 300 times where EPA specifically said we are taking comment on this issue. Several alternatives are proposed where they are asking, please let us know which approach you believe is the best. So there's quite a lot of material and quite a lot to comment on that a lot of your state officials are probably working on as we speak, as well as all the other stakeholders. Once that's finalized, which the timetable says June of 2015, that would become a final rule. So EPA would take all those comments, make the changes that they believe are warranted. And based on things that the administrator has said at public meetings, they seem to acknowledge that there will be changes between the proposal stage and the final. It is a very important rule. It is very complex. It affects a lot of states, a lot of companies, a lot of stakeholders, and they do, it seems, really truly anticipate that they will be getting comments that they will need to change things in the rule. So we'll need to kind of really look in June of next year how this is all finalized. That, once it's final, the states then have an obligation to develop a plan. This is for their own state, how they're going to implement these 111D standards. Under the Clean Air Act authority, which there's this section 111D of the Act, it puts the obligation on the states to actually develop the performance standards for their existing power plants. And then they submit the plan to EPA for review. So there is a partnership between the states and EPA. The states have been given a lot of flexibility in terms of developing that plan, but it will be reviewable by EPA. In terms of compliance, when does that actually happen for the units on the ground? When do they have to make changes? According to the proposal, it begins in 2020 with a 10-year phase-in period, and the final goal is a 2030 level. So there is a lot of time provided in that to get to that level and to sort of phase in these requirements. But again, there are requirements starting in 2020. So just real briefly, I'll go over the Clean Air Act authority on this issue and where this has sort of grown from. There was a Supreme Court decision, Massachusetts versus EPA, that addressed EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And as a response to that, EPA put forth an endangerment finding, which essentially was a sort of a critical piece of regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, and found that greenhouse gases do endanger public health and welfare. As with many of EPA's regulations, it did go to the courts through judicial review, and actually ultimately to the Supreme Court, where they found with EPA that they appropriately found greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare. So that sort of triggered greenhouse gases being regulated under the Clean Air Act, first for mobile sources, so for cars, and now we're on to the power sector, which is the next source that's being regulated. And again, I mentioned in January the new source standards, so for building a new power plant. Those regulations came out. Now we're talking about the existing standards, which were proposed just this summer. So just to mention, I won't read this for you, certainly can check with the Act, but there's some terminology in the Clean Air Act that's relevant here. You'll hear best system of emission reduction, and this comes from really the definition of a performance standard in the Act, and it applies both for new sources and for existing sources. And that reflects the degree of emission limitation, taking into account the best system of emission reduction, but it also does mention cost. It mentions other impacts, energy requirements. So there is a balancing here where the standards are meant to incorporate all of those factors, and which the administrator determines has been adequately demonstrated, which is where the EPA review portion comes in. So we have 111B as in boy, which again is new sources. That is a federal authority. And then 111D for existing sources, which is, again, this federal-state partnership where EPA puts out the guidelines. That's the proposal that we saw in June. And then states take the next step and develop their own plans. If, in fact, a state does not develop and submit a plan or does not get their plan approved, then EPA is supposed to come out with a federal plan. So there is kind of a backstop authority for a federal implementation if, in fact, the state chooses not to or if they don't submit a approvable plan. So in terms of what are the main features of the 111D regulation, I've gone through some of these, but one of the main things that people will care about in that proposal is the numeric goals that EPA set. So each state gets essentially an emission rate goal, what EPA believes is the best system of emission reduction for that state, and they are in fact unique to each state. In terms of the plan, I think I mentioned they're due to EPA in June 2016, but there is an opportunity to get a 1 or 2 year extension. And one of the things that happened before the proposal came out, EPA did a lot of listening sessions, a lot of stakeholder outreach, and from the variety of different stakeholders, including the states and the companies and others, one of the strongest themes was flexibility. Give us the flexibility to be able to accommodate our unique features, our own generation mix, the future that we have already planned. Many states have a lot of programs in place that affect their power sector. And I think most people will agree that EPA was responsive to that. Maybe one of those things, be careful what you wish for. There is quite a lot of flexibility, which certainly has benefits. It allows states to sort of craft something that works for their state. The downside is that it will take a lot of resources at the state level to do the analysis, to do the planning, to try and weave a plan that fits with that and fits with their existing, what they have in place. I mentioned the timing already, where there's a 10-year phase-in between 2020 and 2030. States, again, have the option to choose the policy design. So there are different options. There's many states that have programs in place, like renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency resource standards. These kind of tools can be used. They can use their existing programs. They maybe accelerate some of the targets in those programs. Or there are other policy designs available. And for power plant regulations that have occurred up till now, there are several successful policy designs available for states to choose. Things like emissions budget with trading or tradable performance standards, which allow averaging between units so that not every single unit has to meet the proposed standard, but as a group they can meet it, which means if it's lower cost to make the reductions at one plant and allow the other plant to emit much higher than the rate, you're still allowed to comply that way. So EPA has not specified the means to get there. They've just specified the goalpost and allow the states to develop their own plan. There's also an opportunity to work with other states, and there's already a lot of conversations going on between states about whether there would be benefits to doing some sort of a collaborative approach, multi-state approach. So there's some possibility for that in at least some areas of the country. And some different options for how to make the reductions. This is not a requirement that every plant put on, for example, CCS. The rule does not require, sort of a end of pipe technology for every plant. There's really a lot of different options to get there. So I know some of you are thinking, but what is the impact of this? What is it going to cost? So what I will tell you is that the numbers I'm showing here are from EPA's own analysis. I'm sure that over the next months we will see a lot of different numbers from a lot of different people. There were some analyses done before the rule came out, but because it is really somewhat different from what some people projected, or a lot of people projected, it's probably best to look at analyses that come out after the proposal, so you know that you're looking at something that's really assessing the true proposal. So EPA's numbers at this point are probably the only thing that fall in that category. There's a few that are starting to trickle out, but I know that these numbers will be debated and others will have very different numbers to show. But in terms of EPA's analysis, they suggest that electricity prices will go up in the 2020 timeframe 6 to 7%, but by 2030 that would only be 3% electricity price increase, and that's compared to what would have happened otherwise, which is based on a projection of business as usual without a 111D scenario. So again, there's always a lot of subjectivity when you're sort of projecting a future without something. The interesting thing is that you don't see the same numbers and the same picture in terms of the impact on electricity prices and electricity bills. And a big part of that is because this rule does incentivize and allow energy efficiency. That's on the end side. So reducing the demand for electricity, things like light bulbs and insulation and industrial programs that produce more for less energy. And because of that, the projection, at least, is that the electricity bills will go up 3% in 2020, but by 2030, because of all this efficiency, that electricity bills, how much you're paying in a monthly average bill, will actually go down by 9%. Again, I suspect that there will be debate on this topic, and different analysts will have different numbers, but that is the projected number here. And then in terms of job impacts, again, another area which is there's a lot of different methodologies to determine and project what the impact on jobs will be, and you'll see different numbers from different analysts, many that vastly differ from this. But again, from EPA's own analysis, they expect to create jobs in electricity, coal, and natural gas in 2020. So a lot of this is the construction jobs, the jobs for sort of the temporary jobs to implement the changes that might be needed on site, but then that we would have a reduction in job years. That's each if you have one job that lasts for 10 years, you actually get 10 job years out of that. So that there would be a job loss in that sector by 2030, and that there will be a lot of jobs created in energy efficiency sort of jobs, sort of doing the end-use energy efficiency improvements across the economy. Just in terms of background, one of the key features of the EPA requirements are these state goals. So each state gets a number that they're supposed to design their own program to reach that endpoint. And it is based on 4 different building blocks, how EPA developed this. So it's a consistent methodology that's applied for every state, but because you have a different starting point and you have different numbers for each state on each one of these blocks, you get a different number for each state. So the first is coal plant heat rate improvements. These are things that can be done at a coal plant to improve its efficiency so that it produces electricity with lower emissions. Number 2, the second building block, is increasing use of existing natural gas units, so shifting dispatch to the underutilized units in the existing fleet. Number 3 is clean generation, and this is bringing on new renewable power, as well as some interesting provisions on how to deal with nuclear units in the existing fleet that are considered vulnerable. So these are units that you might think would keep on running for quite a few more years, but due to a variety of factors, including some of the market dynamics, some of these nuclear units are having trouble competing, and in some areas of the country are at risk of early retirement, which clearly has an impact on CO2 emissions, because that zero carbon generation would need to be made up with something, and unless it's renewables, it would actually increase CO2 emissions in those states. So a mechanism to try and preserve some of those units, which already has gotten a lot of comments about the way they went around about it, is maybe not the right way of doing it, but I think they'll probably have a lot of comments about different options for treating that issue and trying to get to that, trying to achieve that goal. And then the 4th building block is end-use energy efficiency, and this is looking at the full use of electricity in your state and options to improve your productivity and have more energy efficiency. So even though those 4 building blocks are 4 distinct measures, in terms of actually what are available to states and companies to reach the goal, there's a larger suite of options. So one is the on-site measures, which similar to, we talked about the first building block, those actual efficiency improvements, but certainly units are also able to do fuel switching, co-firing, and CCS technology, although not required, is an option, and there are some demonstration units and a plant that NRG is actually starting to build in a retrofit project in Texas. So there's maybe by 2030, maybe that's something that will be more relevant. Shifting generation, again, it's beyond just the existing units in the fleet, but in terms of complying, you can get there by any changes that reduce emissions. And other things like reductions in transmission and distribution losses are also something that could be used to reach the goal. So one important thing to keep in mind, electricity does not obey state borders. This just shows some of the regional transmission organizations to get a sense for some of the power markets in the U.S. And so recognizing that and recognizing there are a lot of multi-state companies and a lot of states that already coordinate on things, that there are some opportunities for multi-state collaboration, and there already are discussions beginning state to state about what would be the benefit of going in on an implementation plan together. And that could be something formal, like one plan for a group of states, or it could be more informal collaboration, each state keeping their own state implementation plan, their own process, but trying to harmonize some features state to state so that there would be, instead of a patchwork of 50 different programs, and more consistency across states. So that's something that a lot of states are starting to look to, and a lot of analysts believe that has the possibility to provide a lot of lower cost options in terms of how to implement the program. States clearly have a very important role to play in this process, given their authority to develop the plans for their own state. And again, these discussions across within states between different officials, which in many cases are beginning, I think it's an important question as legislators to ask, are these conversations happening between different departments in your state? Are they reaching out to stakeholders? Many states are beginning to have these stakeholder outreach because, as everyone is reading this proposal, trying to absorb it together, learn together, have a common sense of where the problems are and where are the opportunities. Looking for what should be commented on in the rule, again, there are many opportunities to comment, and because these state goals are so important, states really want to take a look at them before the end of the comment period and make sure that they point out any discrepancies with the data or any unique features that, that consistent methodology that EPA applied is not going to work maybe in every single state. There'll be some issues, and that's your opportunity to comment and see if you can get those things changed. Certainly there are states that have made it clear that they're interested in more of a litigation strategy. So there are clearly some concerns about the legality of some aspects of this and the authority. I think we fully expect that this would go to the courts, and many people are sort of speculating how much of it will get out of that process. And I think unless you happen to be one of the 3 judges on the panel that ultimately gets picked for the D.C. Circuit to judge this, you probably shouldn't trust all the different speculation on whether this is going to make it through and how much is going to make it through. I think the important part, if you look at the history of how the courts rule, it's not always what people expect. So we don't know what the rule will be, what the courts will end up upholding and not upholding. I think as a no-regret strategy, a lot of states are taking the tack that whether, even if they strongly believe that they want to fight this through one channel or the other, it's quite possible it will survive all those obstacles, and you'll be faced with what's left. So it's really important to engage, even if that is your strategy, and make sure that if it is something that you're faced with in a few years from now, that you're well positioned, that you've taken the opportunity to comment, to bring in your unique state features, and to think about the planning process, because there's a lot to be done in just a short amount of time. It's also, these existing trends in the power sector, existing programs that you already have in place. There are many things that work together. This kind of goes back to that initial slide about all the factors that are already changing the power sector. Yes, this creates some challenges. It's a lot, change is hard, and it's disruptive, and But it also has some opportunities, and I think many states are seeing this as an opportunity to find the synergies and do the no regrets measures that work well for your state and your stakeholders, and solve multiple policy goals for your state. So something to keep in mind. And with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker.